Hey everyone, Pitch Canker here, and today I want to talk about why I think horror movies are kind of generally boring and what the genre needs to thrive. I am a full-time horror illustrator myself, and I think that the direction of horror in film inspires a lot of other media, so I think this will be a relevant discussion video if you're interested in horror in general. Now, I think contemporary horror is generally locked in this cycle that is just very predictable. It's very monotonous. In my last video, I talked about desensitization to horror and how a lot of that has to do with contemporary horror being aimed at an introductory audience. Now, I don't think this is an excuse for the genre, and a lot of you agreed. There were over 1,000 comments on this last video, and a lot of people talked about how bored they were with the current state of the genre. I tried to read as many of these comments as I could, but if you're interested in horror discourse, I highly suggest you read some of the opinions and perspectives of people in the comments on that video. Now, my goal with this video is to explore the root cause of stagnation in the horror genre, like right at this minute, and look at innovative approaches to revitalize the genre. And hopefully we can once again have like a widespread terror across the genre that people can get excited about. I'm going to break this down into 5 different parts to keep it kind of digestible.
Part 1. St Tropes.
Horror is a genre currently that relies on tropes so heavily that predictability has become inevitable, right? The element of surprise has been completely destroyed, and the level of predictability leaves just no room for dread or terror. And I think dread and terror, are two sides of the same coin, right? Terror and horror are often conflated, but I think that their definitions are really important to understand when dissecting something like this. So, terror is the apprehension of something horrible, right? It's the anxiety received when something isn't right, when something terrible is coming, when the thing you most fear is drawing near, but it isn't there yet. It's still just an anticipation. It's building up towards this moment of horror. And then you have horror, and horror is defined as like the realization of terror, right? You expect something terrible to come, but you weren't sure what, right? Horror comes from the realization of that terrible thing coming, right? The object of fright has arrived, and simultaneously, there is this moment of relief, like disgust, revulsion, fear, all those things that we commonly associate with horror. I would even say that horror is kind of the main goal of a lot of these movies, and terror is kind of the way to get there. Now, when I go into a movie that's like a slasher or a haunted house film, I know what type of horror movie it is, I've already ruined a big part of the terror that can be produced because I am understanding what kind of scares I'm probably in for, right? This in turn diminishes the horror that can occur when the scares finally happen, right? I think the best type of horror films kind of defy definition, right? I think a good example of this is the movie Noroi. I hope I'm saying that right. Noroi the Curse is a great example of defying definition to me. Like I'll suggest this movie to people, and when they ask what it's about, I honestly like don't know what to tell them. The plot is complex, and the scares can't really be boiled down to singular moments, right? Another film I suggest that I have a hard time explaining to people is The Wailing. It's like a 2.5 horror epic from Korea, and I could say it's about a father and his daughter dealing with this like kind of cursed situation, but that doesn't really describe what happens. And because there's so many insane things that happen, there's so much character development, you know. But if I tell you to watch like the 15th Conjuring movie, I could tell you it's just about some kind of exorcism and about these two people who are like, ghost hunters basically. Like that's really just about the size of it. And this kind of plays back into that core idea with horror, right? That like you're afraid of the unknown, you're afraid of what you don't understand. And if you just kind of already understand what you're getting yourself into before watching a movie like this or whatever, it's going to be boring. It's going to like defeat a lot of the purpose of that horror, of that terror. And I think a way creators can combat this is to really be, I don't want to just say unpredictable, right? I think the movie Barbarian actually does a really good job of being completely unpredictable. Like there was at no point in that movie did I understand what was going to be happening next. And that did give this type of fear. That's a very extreme example. But I think you can also just make plot lines less archetypal, less tropey, just do things that maybe wouldn't make sense in a normal horror environment. And that could be really interesting. That could be really fun, right? I think there is a level of fun that needs to be had with exploring these concepts and ideas. And speaking of this kind of like development of plot and things like that, I want to move into another section, part 2, character development.
Part 2. Boring characters.
Now, I think one of the most common and egregious errors of the horror genre is the constant stupidity of characters and their kind of like skin deep natures, right? It's like a meme inside and outside of the genre that characters in horror movies have like no survival instincts, that they're stupid, that they don't make any sense, how their reactions to the situation are unrealistic, right? This is an immediate way to sever the viewer's connection with the character, right? And trivialize whatever is going through, right? You could have the scariest thing in the world happening, but if the character is a fool, it's like, why am I? Why I wouldn't have been in this situation? I'm not an idiot, right? I live for a memorable character in any media, and horror is definitely not an exception. Horror movie characters are often just like relegated to positions of plot devices or like an archetype, right? Like the stupid one, like the guy who actually knows what's going on. It's just so overdone. And I think the thing is like, what's really cool about horror is the way it can warp the human experience. It's the way that it can change our personalities, right? By creating interesting, deep, deceptive, caring, and emotionally complex characters, the audience becomes way more interested in the stakes of the situation, just become so much more personal, right? You might know people like this. You might know people who have had a change in personality because something bad happened to them. You might be like, oh, well, this person cracked under pressure. Maybe that's what I would do too. You might find yourself associating more with the character, and therefore you are more involved, you're more invested in the movie in general. You're actually putting yourself in the shoes of the character, which I think is just such an important part of horror, is to actually be there in the moment of this terrifying thing that's about to happen. This is a good segue to part three, which is the terrifying thing and a big problem I have with a lot of contemporary horror, and that's jump scares and gratuitous violence.
Part 3. Toothless Scares.
Jump scares and gratuitous violence. A jump scare is a party trick, right? You do it once, and although it can shock and kind of surprise the people you're showing initially, it only really works once, right? If you showed me a trick where you pull a coin from behind my ear, I would be, kind of surprised the first time I was performing. I'd be like, wow, it's kind of crazy, man. Now, imagine you did this to me 20 more times over the course of the party, pulling different objects out from behind my ear. I would not only be unsurprised, I would probably figure out the trick and find it kind of annoying. And I feel really similarly about gratuitous violence and jump scares in general. They all kind of fall under that umbrella for me. I think they can be done tastefully, but like generally speaking, I think that these tactics just elicit momentary shocks, and they fail to sustain that sense of dread throughout the narrative. They fail to create a sense of terror that I spoke about earlier. In fact, by including too many jump scares, including too many of these like really eviscerating moments, I think it actually kills the dread, it kills the terror, and it just it interrupts that building of tension for something that is like, again, a cheap trick. And, as a creator, there are a million ways to leverage terror, many of which probably haven't even been explored super thoroughly, right? Sound design, cinematography, pacing, characters, plotline, these can all instill a sense of unease that lingers long after the end of a movie, or like, whatever it might be, a piece of art, a piece of media, whatever it is. The goal is to drench the audience, to submerge them in a pool of terror. Like, to me, a jump scare is a cup of cold water thrown onto the face of the viewer. It's not the deep water of the ocean drowning them. And I think that's so important. And this kind of leads me to my last part, which is, fear is different for everybody, right? And we get kind of like a microcosm of that fear, at least where I'm at in North America and like the kind of film industry we're in. I think that we have a lot of like jump scares and like violence and stuff like that. And I really think that's just due to a lack of diversity within the genre. And I think that can be solved by looking out to other places that are creating horror. And that brings me to my fourth part, a lack of diversity.
Part 4. Deficient Perspective.
Now, I think many contemporary horror films are dominated by like super homogenous casts and perspectives. Like, if you were to take one cast of a horror movie, generally speaking, like of a slasher, haunted house film, exorcism film, whatever, you could almost just interchange them, right? And I think the thing is, like, I find myself enjoying more and more horror films from like other countries simply because the change of perspective and culture is like really interesting, right? The human experience is so rich and diverse, and like different locations and cultures like really exemplify that best. Like, I love the movie Lake Mungo. It's one of my favorite horror movies. I'm always talking about it. I brought it up in the last video. And it takes place in Australia. It takes place in a place that I'm not super familiar with, right? Like, the actual location of Lake Mungo is really weird and eerie to me just because of where it's shot, right? And then you go into other types of film and media, right? Like, I love Japanese and Korean horror. There's just like a really good pacing to it, right? The sense of dread they build is different. The way they approach scares is a lot different. There's a lot more build up, right? And then you have something really extreme like Italian horror, right? Where it's like really intense mixtures of like murder, mystery, and like supernatural elements. Like you could think of something like Suspiria, which is just so over the top and crazy and just like super has like a very cool aesthetic around it, right? I think by studying films outside of the American ecosystem, we can find just like swaths of really cool inspiration to pull from. And I think that's just happening naturally anyways with like the dawn of the internet and all that. So, to wrap this section up, I would love to ask you about your opinion about the different types of horror that you've seen from just different places, right? Outside of the normal ecosystem. It could be from anywhere though. It could be like American horror from like the Midwest that I haven't heard of, or like some really like, niche part of the country that like you just don't see horror coming out of. It's not like New York or LA or something like that. It could be from Canada, it could be from South America, it could like, Africa. I don't hear a lot about African horror, but like I just haven't explored it a lot. I think it'd be really cool if anybody has cool suggestions for horror movies or like any kind of horror content from different places, and outside of kind of the norm. It would just be great to go over all that information in the comments. So please feel free to just kind of talk about whatever you want down there.
Part 5. Conclusion.
In conclusion, while contemporary horror may sometimes falter in its ability to thrill and captivate, I think there exists just tremendous potential for revitalization and just kind of like reinvention, right? To be contrarian, to challenge conventions, to develop like really compelling characters, prioritizing the atmosphere over jump scares, and really embracing the diversity of different ideas and different fears across cultures. I think creators can transcend the current landscape and the limitations of the genre and like create work that's not only beautiful and terrifying, but is also thought provoking and kind of sticks with you. I always think, again, my favorite film, Lake Mungo, I think about it long after I've watched it. That sense of dread is there with me when I sit in my bed. It's there with me when I think about loss. It is a very frightening feeling. And I think that like every movie deserves that. Every piece of media deserves to kind of have that like lingering sensation, at least in the horror genre. Contemporary horror has so much potential, and just like every golden period of horror, it will be realized when innovators take up the reins and just flip the genre on its head. And I think we're just coming up on that, and I'm really excited about it. Finally, I don't have a sponsor for this video, but I do want to plug my own services. I am an illustrator and I basically live off my commissions. So if you want to make something really scary, all the work in the background of this video is my own. I have experience working with really small creators and really big ones. And I love all kinds of projects. I do tattoos for people. I do book covers. I do all kinds of things. I love working on indie projects. I love working on personal pieces. I love working on really big projects. So please, if you have any kind of question you would like to ask about a commission, there is a link to my commission form in the bottom of this video. I'm always looking for something fun to work on, so please feel free to reach out. Don't be afraid. The work might be scary, but I'm pretty easy to work with. As always, for anyone who's watched this far, thank you so much for watching. You guys are the best. I hope you're really liking this new content I'm trying to produce. If you have any suggestions for future videos, please let me know. I'm always open to suggestions in the comments. I think that, these kind of discussion pieces we have are always great because, I get so many different views on things that I personally didn't think of. So please let me know what you think. Let me know where you'd like me to go next. And thank you, of course, to my Patreon supporters. You guys are the best. Thank you for always supporting the work. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. And, keep creative, keep creating, and stay inspired.